a.m., and I'm going to call this meeting to order. I want to begin by introducing board members and staff. To my left is board member Dee Adamo. Joining her at some point in the next 20 minutes or so will be Fran Spivey Weber, vice chair. To my right is board member Tam Dodak, and to her right, board member Stephen Moore. Mr. Bishop.
Good morning, Madam Chair. To my left is Chief Counsel Michael Laufer, and to my right is Chief Deputy Karen Turkovich, and assisting the board today is Janine Townsend.
Terrific, thank you. As you all know, we have an emergency evacuation procedure. It's pretty commonsensical. If the alarm goes off, leave the room, take your stuff, take your friends, proceed carefully down the stairs to Cesar Chavez Park across the street. You can go anywhere you want, obviously, but if you're there, you'll know when the all clear comes. Please speak into the microphone when you come up. I am not a good role model for this because I forget to do it, but it's important that you get close to the microphone in order to be heard because the meeting is being webcast and recorded. So that is important. And then finally, importantly, turn your cell phones on stun or turn them off. Same with pagers so that we don't interrupt any of the speakers and detract from the very important issues that we're going to be talking about. Thank you all for joining us in something of an update session on crucially important and challenging I want to say bit of work. I'd say a lot of work that we're all engaged on, and the more engagement, the better. So with that, I want to turn it to Mr. Bishop or Ms. Turkovich to introduce it.
Well, yes, so the first item is a update on our water activities on the water quality control plan, and Grover is going to lead us on this. Are you having anyone join you, Mr. Grover?
Right. And before you start, Mr. Grover, just a couple of things. We're going to go out of order. We're going to go to item 11 after item 9 and then to item 10. I'm not entirely sure why, but that's what we're going to do. And just so you know, and depending on how long the session takes, this won't necessarily be evident to those of you who weren't here yesterday, but I'm going to be a more courteous chair, and we will take some sort of short mid-morning break, which we didn't do yesterday. I have a tendency to just keep going. So we will take some sort of a short break somewhere between 10 and 11.
Good morning. My name is Les Grober. I'm the Assistant Deputy Director for Water Rights, and I'm going to give you an update today on our Bay Delta activities. And I'm joined here today by Diane Riddle, Environmental Program Manager of the Special Programs Bay Delta section. And this is to provide some context for the next two items that you're going to hear. Really, it's to provide an update to you, and good morning, everybody, to show you where we are with our multi-phased effort on Bay Delta planning and Bay Delta watershed flow activities. And as you know, this is part of our comprehensive efforts with regard to the Bay Delta, but today we're just going to be focusing on this four-phased effort. This is the update of the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, the implementation of the plan, and also flow requirements for priority tributaries to the Bay Delta. So phase one, which is what we're furthest along with, that's San Joaquin River flow and Southern Delta water quality objectives for agricultural protection. And phase two is the comprehensive review. So that's everything else in the Bay Delta plan update, and that's the water quality control planning update. Phase three is the water rights implementation of those first two phases. And phase four, as I said, that's the looking at flow objectives for tributaries to the Delta. So first, the status of our phase one update. As you know, we released at the end of last year, we released the environmental documents and the proposed changes to the water quality control plan for San Joaquin River flow and Southern Delta salinity objectives. And in March, we held a public hearing. We received useful information and comments. We also received a week after that, and you smile because we received extensive and useful comments from the board and from the public. And we've been looking at that information and have determined, based on looking at the volume of that information, and it was good comments that we've received all around, that it will likely require a re-release of the document and to receive additional comments. And we anticipate doing that by sometime this fall. And that puts us on a track now for to consider adoption sometime in early 2014. So that means that we're going to have another round of comments really on the re-release documents, because we're going to try to address the long list of things that we had heard, and I think it will be an improved document. For the Phase 2 status, just where we've been and what we've completed, we had last fall, we had a series of informational workshops on ecosystem changes, the low salinity zone in September, on fishery resources, and then finally on analytic tools and hydrodynamics. We then released a draft workshop summary that was prepared by a consultant that was working with us through ICF, and had a discussion on that report and also a presentation from the Delta Science Program at an April 9th workshop, thinking about, well, what are our next steps and how do we proceed with this? And some of what we heard at that time was we heard a proposal from the science program to do a series of workshops, and their parlance workshops, to develop the information where there were the areas of uncertainty with regard to Phase 2. And those two workshops that we're looking to hold in the fall, and I think at the time in April we thought we would be having those even in the summer and early fall. It looks, the reality is, by the time we get contracts in place and have the public process to provide feedback as to what should be the specific nature of those workshops, it looks like more the later fall that we would be having those. And the two major topic areas, this has also been transitioning from the original proposal, would be for delta outflow and other measures related to the Phase 2 effort, and then internal delta flows or hydrodynamics and also other measures. So we feel, and in our initial discussions with the Delta Science Program, that those two major topic areas would cover the major areas of uncertainty that have been in play and been discussed.
Right. Well, I was going to say, in addition to the Fish and Wildlife doing the panels on predation, because if they weren't, we would.
That's the next thing I was going to say. So,
Sorry.
in parallel with this process, already had been in process Delta Science Program, and our staff has now been involved with that. There's going to be a predation workshop that is already scheduled now for July 22nd and 23rd. So this puts us on track for, because as you know, we can still continue to prepare information in-house, but the workshops that we were holding will inform the preparation of that material. So we anticipate release of the technical basis reports in the winter 2013 or early 2014 for the Phase 2 effort.
Who is doing the predation workshop?
That's the Delta Science Program.
So it'll be over there.
So it'll be, and where it's going to be held, Diane, do you know where it's going to be held?
I think it's going to be held at UC Davis, and it's in coordination with the Department of Fish and Wildlife. They're partnering with the Delta Science Program.
So Phase 3 status, that is, that's the implementation of Phases 1 and 2, and that's going to be up to the board when we get across the finish line with the Phase 1 and the Phase 2, when we would actually commence this phase. So that will be determined as we get further along and get across the finish line with the Phase 1 effort. And of course, that effort in and of itself could be phased, but that's somewhat down the road. And then the Phase 4 status, that's where we're developing information for flow criteria and also for flow objectives for priority tributaries. And as you recall, in fact, all of this work is now, these are some of the priority actions identified in the Delta plan that has received recent news. It's a priority action for us to develop the flow objectives for the Delta, but also for priority tributaries. And for the priority tributaries, the target date is 2018. So we're in the process now of entering into an interagency agreement, and that's to cover work both in terms of helping to develop the methods that can be used to develop flow criteria that would inform our development of flow objectives, but also the work that they're going to be doing with us to for the phase 2 effort for the workshop. So we're entering into that interagency agreement now. We're also, within the next few weeks, going to be submitting potential flow criteria methods for their review and evaluation, and that's to help guide us on the methods that we would use, because the intent there is, do we do tributary by tributary, or we can do something more, multiple tributaries, because the objective there is to get the best information we can, but not have to necessarily do tributary by tributary, which would take quite some number of years. And then finally, and this is related to the phase 2 effort, because it covers some of the same information, we have been reviewing now the administrative draft of the environmental documents for the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. And as we've shared with you in the past, and as has been a component of our work plan, we've hoped that this would provide information that would inform our phase 2 effort, and it has information that will inform our phase 2 effort. But also in parallel, we're reviewing the document to see, well, does it provide useful information for the phase 2 effort, but does it also meet our needs for any petitions that will be presented to us for a change in the point of diversion and other things like that. So we're reviewing those, I don't know, the whole 30,000 pages, but the targeted pages that will provide the information for us to give them initial comments on the administrative draft on, what more could be needed to inform our decision making. So we're doing that now. We're going to be working, and doing this, we're working also, not independently. We've been meeting with the fishery agencies to see, kind of tearing off of work that they've been done, because they've been working very closely with BDCP over a number of years. We're also in conversations with the Delta Science Program and US EPA, just to kind of, the combined knowledge to prepare informed comments. We'll be continuing then to work with staff BDCP to resolve any issues and any other things that we think are necessary. So with all of this, we anticipate receiving the petitions for the change petitions, the point of diversion. The last that we've heard would be in spring of 2014, so that lines up with when we're, have made good progress on the phase 2 effort. And following that, there would be some hearings to consider those potential changes, because there will be inevitable protests and concerns and issues that would need to be resolved. An understatement. And with that,
We are entering a litigious phase, we've noted,
yes,
for all.
So with that, we're available to answer any questions you have.
Can I just add briefly to what Les was putting up on the board regarding our Phase 4 efforts and the Delta Science Program's review of potential flow criteria methodologies, is that we do plan, once we receive the Delta Science Program's comments, input, and recommendations, of taking that and holding a board workshop so that we get input from everybody on, one, the methods, but two, the specific recommendations of the science program before we proceed.
Good, that's excellent.
And that would likely be sometime in the fall that we would expect to get some product. But when we get a little further along in this agreement, we'll know when that would be happening.
Okay. Great. All right. I should start on this side, because I usually start on this side. Question? There you go. Take it away.
Talk about BDCP, and I understand that your staff is putting together comments on the BDCP. It's a massive document. I think all of us, to some degree or another, know a little bit about what's going on, but not maybe everything that we should. And so I think it'd be helpful for us to get a presentation from staff and also from the agencies that are working on BDCP. I know that there's a process that they're looking at that's somewhat similar to what we're talking about on adaptive management, the decision tree, and some way to resolve some unknown issues or unresolved issues, not unknown issues, but unresolved issues on flow. And so I think it'd be useful to better understand what that process is, how it relates, how it doesn't relate to what we're doing.
Actually, I think that's a really good idea, to do something over here. So we can talk to them about doing that. And obviously, we have the same or overlapping stakeholders, but I agree with that suggestion. I think it'd be a good thing to do.
So we'll make a request to the Resources Agency to identify a board meeting in which they could come and provide an overview of the documents that are out and their process, and incorporate a discussion of how the two processes interrelate.
And I would just say, I know they all have a lot on their plate, but to the extent possible, to get the main participants, the fishery agencies, to be included in that briefing.
Okay. And did you had mentioned also the decision tree and adaptive management, did you envision that all being part of one? Or because that's, of course, an important topic, and that's something the Delta Science Program is looking into, and we've been having discussions with the Delta Science Program, is what constitutes a successful adaptive management program. So did you envision that as part of the BDCP or as something else separately?
Well, I would just leave it up to you. I think that when it comes to how their process relates to ours, I suspect that that's a key area, and maybe there's so much to talk about that it would warrant a second day or a second briefing. I don't know.
Yeah, we had talked earlier about doing
Even doing
you
a
had also
full-blown.
suggested an adaptive management workshop. So,
Right.
So we'll do some
you-
follow-up, and
you
we'll
think
make a
about it.
proposal.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's great. Good question. All right, we have a few speakers this morning before we move to the next items. Bill Jennings first from CSPA, CWIN, and Aqua Alliance, followed by Tim O'Laughlin from the SJTA. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Chair Marcus, board members, and also Restore the Delta, I guess. I didn't put that down. I first have a question of Les. Do you envision the change of petition hearings or the change of diversion, point of diversion hearings occurring as a separate hearing or as part of one of the phases of the Bay Delta process?
I think given the timing, I think we would likely be entertaining it separately. But, I mean, there's some time between now and then to see how things are occurring. But given the timeline I presented here today, it seems that we would be getting a petition before we would have the information for our Phase 2 update.
I understand. Okay. I was just dispatched here to reiterate or clarify in case any of you are confused as to what our position is through this process. I just wanted to clarify. I mean, I've been appearing before this board for almost 30 years. And after 3 decades of water rights and water quality proceedings, a suite of biological opinions, myriad collaborative restoration stakeholder and adaptive management processes, the Delta's biological tapestry is disintegrating and the state's water delivery system is in crisis. And by any standard, by any definition, that's an astonishing collective failure. Water supply is in crisis because we've overpromised, wasted, and inequitably distributed a limited resource. The Delta is in crisis because we've deprived the estuary of half its historical flow, turned its hydrograph on its head, and used its waters as sewers. And these crises exist because of an egregious failure to comply with or enforce the broad array of laws enacted to allocate water and protect the environment. And the magnitude of these crises is such that there is no longer any win-win, painless solutions, and the status quo is not sustainable, and political deals are no longer effective. These crises cannot be resolved if the causes that created them are not addressed, and if the explicit provisions of law are not followed. And throughout this proceeding, we've been consistent in our recommendations. And we believe that the Delta must be considered as a whole. It cannot be segmented or piecemealed. And for example, the upstream San Joaquin River, west side discharges, the exports cannot continue to be ignored. The effort should be consolidated into an extended evidentiary proceeding with sworn testimony, cross-examination, and rebuttal, because this is the only way to resolve the ubiquitous he said, she said claims. I mean, we can only take so many bites at the apple. The constitutional mandates of reasonable use and public trust doctrine must be incorporated meaningfully into the process. The board has already conducted the legislatively directed public proceeding that established, based on best available science, flows needed to protect public trust resources. The Department of Fish and Wildlife conducted a similar proceeding and did likewise. It's time to move to a full, formal balancing, including benefit-cost analyses of the competing demands. This board has never formally examined the serious waste and unreasonable use of Delta water. It's time to do so, in conformance with Article 10, Section 2 of the state constitution. This board has never addressed the five-fold over-appropriation of water in a Delta watershed that was fully subscribed by 1903. It needs to do so, in accordance with 150 years of riparian and appropriative law and legal precedent. There are reasonable and viable solutions that will protect water supply and provide Delta restoration, but the status quo is not one of them. And if the board cannot bring itself to address these issues, then the courts will. I mean, there are only 7 lawsuits and 30-odd organizations that contesting the failures of the Delta Stewardship Council. You're more important. I mean, in this proceeding, the line at the filing window of the courthouse will be out the door and around the block. And I would just suggest that when all else fails, and all else has failed for 30 years, you might try following the law. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jennings. Good reminder. Next, Tim O'Laughlin, San Joaquin Tributary Authority, and then Tracy Skelton from the Earth Law Center.
Morning, board chair, board members. Actually, I don't have anything to say, but I have a bunch of questions, so can I ask questions? Is that okay?
That is okay.
Thank you. So I'm not familiar with the term re-release. I've never heard that terminology before, so will staff, is that like recirculation?
We're recirculating, yes.
Oh, okay, good. Thanks. All right.
It's like that latest edition of the band's greatest hits that's on the Starbucks shelf today.
We shall
Re-release.
re-release? I like that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Moving on. The next question is, are you going to have some, I mean, and I don't know how we do this, but in the context of the re-release, are you going to have some discussion or review internally among yourselves first before the re-release? There was a ton of, and I thought it was pretty interesting when I summarized the documents. So a lot of people weren't happy about certain items, and are you going to let people know ahead of time that some things are changing or some things aren't changing and the basis for what's going to happen? So I'll take it for instance. For like the water surface elevation model, you heard numerous comments about the water surface elevation model. My understanding currently is that staff is still using the water surface elevation model. So, I mean, from my perspective, if the regulated community and even the NGOs and everybody believes that the WSE model is not the appropriate model and isn't being used properly, should we have a discussion about that before we see it in another re-release document? In other words, there are some major points that were embedded within that document that might be fruitful for some discussions. Another one is the goal. I think when you heard from all the regulated community, the question of your goal embedded within the document was up for consideration. And so it's kind of interesting to know where we're going to go with the goal, because we went from a natural production of anadromous fish doubling goal. You've changed the goal to another narrative thing. You've heard from a lot of people about smart objectives and smart goals. Should we develop those? Should we start talking about those? Are we going to develop those, and are we going to see those in the document? So in other words, my concern is we get another recirculated document out there and we have some of the same fundamental problems and issues that we've had back in March. and we go through the same reiterative cycle again, making the same comments on the same stuff, going nowhere. So, in other words, I want to try to identify or understand how we, the regulated community, are going to feed into your process to help you, or is this just going to be staff's going to come up with another draft and put it out on the street? And you don't have to answer that question.
Well, no, I can answer that question, I think.
Oh, okay.
Which is that staff took in we were all listening, taking notes on the comments. I think we've each had we can't talk together, but download conversations with staff about the different things we heard. And my impression is, I'll just say that staff heard a lot of the arguments about different parts of this document and how adequate they are. And we've had conversations with you and different people about different parts of it as we've continued our ongoing conversations, at least individually, with stakeholders. And they have a pretty comprehensive list of having heard the critique and having to reevaluate or change it or clarify it or whatever.
Okay.
So they have a whole list. I'm not sure it can't be death by a thousand cuts either, where we have workshops on every issue that was in an SED. I think what they're trying to do is deal with the flaws that people articulated about the SED. I don't think it's necessarily all or nothing, but I also don't feel like we can have endless sessions on each aspect of it, because that would take us forever. But I feel like staff's been, you don't know this yet, but that they've been pretty responsive to what's been said on all sides of it. But Les, why don't you talk about
I think
your...
that's exactly right. And for a specific example here, we've already reached out some, and moving forward, this will be an opportunity to get, say, model runs and things that you presented, some of the results, to make sure that we have the numbers, and to see, can we duplicate analyses that we've done with what you provided, with the, water surface elevations, things like that, and to see, what is the best tool to use, and how do we come to some agreement, at least on the technical questions that were raised. So we intend to, and as you said, Felicia, not necessarily have formal workshops, which wouldn't necessarily get us that far along, but to have the one-on-one meetings with the people that provided the information to make sure that we understand it and can address it in the next round.
That's very helpful. I have another follow-up question. BDCP, I've been harping on this for 3 years, in the integration or sequencing of the Bay Delta process with BDCP. So now that BDCP has hit the streets, and we've been reading all 15,000 pages of it, it's interesting how BDCP and your process doesn't match up. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, when the matchup occurs. So I'm going to use an example. I think it would be helpful. So currently, under your proposed SED, and I know you're going to go through recirculation, but the current SED has a February through June flow component for spring pulse flow. The BDCP component is March, April, May. So I'm not saying that you can't have two separate ones. I'm not saying that they can't be different. And they may be serving different purposes for different things at different times. But how is that integration going to occur? Because you have our train going down the track currently with phase 1, and the major portion of phase 1 is this February through June time period outflow. And then you're going to have BDCP behind it. So when's the integration and matchup going to occur, and how's that going to occur? I get it, your staff's going to provide comments, but how do we bring that together in a fashion where the stakeholders can comment on it and tell you why it is or isn't a good thing to integrate BDCP with what you're trying to do? Because if we're sending, I'll just give you I'll be real blunt about this. If we're sending water down in February and June, and it's not doing any good, and it's not helping the exports, and it's not helping BDCP, and that's maybe X amount of water, then from your side of the aisle, on a weighing benefit analysis and weighing and balancing as you have to do, how does that fit in? And if we're going to try to get BDCP done, it seems to me that one of the things the board might want to look at, and you don't have to, is matching up with BDCP to some extent. So that was just a question.
I'm presuming to the
This-
extent that we disagree, it'll be in our comments to them. But
Well, if I may add, because this is an opportunity to punch, I mean, one of the things that I think that we heard with regard to, not to expand this into get into the weeds of the phase one, but the concept of a flow budget is important here. So I think we need to make sure that these documents don't line up and there's a one for everything here, but that's the problem with being too explicit and too prescriptive. And on either end, we need to make sure that they're not mutually exclusive, and that's the thing that we're looking at now. So with regard to flow, to make sure that it lines up with the broad goals that would be establishing here and the framework at which to establish them, and with the same thing that's going on with BDCP. So not necessarily looking for a complete alignment.
Well, I'll just say this, and I know I've told you all this before. I mean, if you have a flow prescription and it's a percentage of unimpaired flow, and it's set during a month time period, we'll never get to water budgets. We just won't. I mean, it's just never going to happen, because I know. Okay,
And we're working on it.
I know you are.
We are.
We're working on it too. So and then the final one is in regards to phase two and moving forward. So and this ties back into BDCP and ties into outflow. So the San Joaquin River currently is February through June. When you read the BDCP documents, you will see that there is a major water cost in fall X2 outflow. And also there are major impacts under BDCP and with OMR flows at other time of the year. So Sac River really doesn't help on OMR flows. So is the San Joaquin River system going to be embedded in phase two as part of that, or are we going to be embedded in a delta outflow proceeding in regards to the change petitions in regards to BDCP? Because currently as it stands under D1641, we're only required to meet the October pulse flow criteria currently set by D1641 and nothing else. And so, and the reason I asked that question is when you're looking at your water budgets, you're going to have a budget for spring, and you're going to come up with whatever you're going to come up with as your alternative. But to do that without the context of what else you're looking for from the San Joaquin River, either for fall X2 or these OMR flows, makes it difficult to understand what the actual final impact analysis is for the San Joaquin. And so at some point in time, if you have some clarification on that, that would be helpful as well.
yeah,
And I appreciate
do
you and your staff's time in meeting with us and discussing these issues in regards to phase one. It's been very helpful.
yeah, for
Thank
us
you.
as well. Good point. Ms. Skelton, thank you.
Good morning, Chair Marcus and board members. My name is Tracy Skelton, and I am here on behalf of Earth Law Center, working with Linda Sheehan. Earth Law Center works to advance the rights of waterways to flow with clean water. Our comments today reflect our March 28th comment letter to the board on the Bay Delta Plan Draft Substitute Environmental Document. We have deep concerns about the draft SCD's ability to protect waterway health. In our letter, we point out that the revised plan and draft SED not only must comply with Porter Cologne, but also with the Federal Clean Water Act. The failure to fully meet the mandates of the Clean Water Act will prevent the state from ensuring the good health of the affected waterways. I'd like to highlight the main points of our letter in this regard. First, California has a mandate under the Clean Water Act to protect waterway beneficial uses, including with respect to flow decisions that impact those uses. This was established in the U.S. Supreme Court decision, PUD number 1 of Jefferson County versus Washington Department of Ecology, which holds that any distinction between water quality and quantity under the acts is artificial. Specifically, the decision highlights that state water rights,
Sorry, it's our favorite case.
Oh.
Sorry.
I'm sure it is, which holds that any distinction between water quality and quantity under the Act is artificial. Specifically, the decision highlights that state water rights can be impacted to meet water quality needs when prompted by legitimate and necessary water quality considerations. Therefore, the board can consider changes to water rights under the Clean Water Act to ensure that waterways have the flows they need to protect beneficial uses. This is a point decisively upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court and must be incorporated into Bay Delta Plan amendments. Second, because state flow and salinity objectives must meet Clean Water Act requirements, they must fully protect, not reasonably protect, beneficial uses. The state must comply with the Clean Water Act along with Port of Cologne. Simply using Port of Cologne's weaker reasonably protect standard is insufficient. Further, if there are multiple use designations, the level of quality necessary is that which maintains the most sensitive use. This directive cannot be balanced away based on other considerations. In addition, a thorough anti-degradation analysis must be completed and publicly circulated consistent with Clean Water Act requirements. Federal anti-degradation requirements are applicable to flow where beneficial uses are to be protected. Relying on the Supreme Court and PUD number 1, the U.S. EPA has stated that an anti-degradation program must obviously address water withdrawals as well as discharges to ensure that there is adequate ability to protect existing uses. Currently, no anti-degradation analysis has been done, despite data showing that, at best, new flows will barely top current inadequate flow levels. In sum, the draft SED adopts a preferred alternative flow requirement that will fail to protect existing beneficial uses in violation of federal laws. This is exemplified by the proposed 35% unimpaired flow recommendation for the San Joaquin River. The Clean Water Act mandates that flow criteria be based in science, and current best available science from the board's August 2010 report has determined that, in fact, 60% of unimpaired flow is needed for the river. This is a significant variance, raising concerns that the board is setting flow criteria outside the act. As, excuse me, I lost my place. And this is something that the U.S. EPA Region 4 cautioned the state of Alabama to avoid. In a recent letter, EPA advised Alabama that it should not set conditions which would be less stringent than or in conflict with the state water quality standards under the Act. It is our concern that California is making this exact mistake with the 35% flow objective. Again, the state cannot rely on Port of Cologne factors that balance away beneficial uses. To do so will enable further decline of Delta health. We strongly urge you to ensure that the state meets the flow-related requirements of the Clean Water Act, which are necessary to ensure that the adopted plan fully, not reasonably, protects beneficial uses. We look forward to working with you to ensure the good health of the Bay Delta for the long term. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Skelton. Any other cards come in? All right. Thank you. Those were helpful comments and bookends, to be sure. All right. No questions. We'll move to item number 11. It goes to 11, Steve.
So item 11 is a presentation on the spring 2013 San Joaquin watershed water transfer to achieve fisheries and water supply, and we have some guest speakers who are going to be making this. Tim, are you leading this?
That's a funny one.
Okay.
Are you ready, David? Yeah. Can we, Ron Milligan's not here from the United States Bureau of Reclamation, who's kind of a component because he has new Maloney's in the exports. So do you mind if the Sac Valley guys go first?
Why we're doing it in
Yeah,
different
the
order.
switch was at their request. So David, if you're wanting to step forward now, that would be fine with us.
Thank you, David.
It doesn't go to 11 yet. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Certainly. That's right. Anywhere you want. Exactly.
Come up here.
Good morning.
Is that better? Good morning, members of the board. Thank you for the opportunity today to come before you and talk about the Sacramento Valley and the various efforts for regional sustainability in the region. There's been a lot of conversations going on around this, and we really appreciate the opportunity to talk and think with you about this. I'm joined here today up here with Louis Baer, the General Manager of RD 108, and Kurt Akins, the General Manager of Yuba County Water Agency. We've been working obviously with a team of a lot of the water resource managers in the region in developing this kind of sustainability concepts, and it's been great working with them. We're also in the audience, have a variety of the council for the region that many of you know. And are doing great work for the region, as well as Walter Bure, who does a lot of support work on the modeling and various technical aspects. So we're real appreciative. All right, what am I doing wrong here? Back or forward?
You're not alone.
I'm either. There we go. Just roll forward. Thank you. So I think obviously folks know the Sacramento Valley. It's the northern part of the Central Valley. The Central Valley sometimes kind of gets lumped together, but the Sacramento Valley is, of course, the northern part of the Central Valley north of Sacramento. Oh, now I'm going backwards. I'm going to get this figured out yet. All right. So I think, you know, the thing that we, of course, like to think about is the unique nature of the Sacramento Valley. And, of course, it's this rich mosaic of a variety of beneficial uses that we're really here today to talk about. And we hope that you'll join in us. Many of you have spent time up in the region. And for those of you who haven't, we encourage you to come join us in exploring the region. It's really just a spectacular region. Obviously, with respect to the beneficial uses, there's a lot of important ones. Obviously, several million acres of the family farms in the region. We got habitat for about half of the endangered species in California. Of course, the winter run and spring run are the endangered species that get most of the attention, and there's some real good things that are going on in that regard, as well as obviously a lot more work ahead that we'll be talking about later. With respect to birds, we have 6 national wildlife refuges, 50 state wildlife areas, and of course all the private managed wetlands that are throughout the region. I think with respect to the birds, Mark Petrie presented at your last workshop back in the fall, and obviously talked quite a bit about the efforts that the Joint Habitat Venture is doing. I think it's been a real success story. And of course, this is the chart that shows ducks, but this is similar for all the birds in the Sacramento Valley or in California. And you notice that blue line in the center, the kind of the turquoise line, is the Sacramento Valley. And I think the bird numbers are very strong across the board, and we're real encouraged by that. And of course, a lot of that has been because of the partnerships in the Sacramento Valley that we're all real proud of. Of course, you have the small towns, rural communities, including the capital of California, as well as, of course, the watersheds of both the Sierra Nevada and the Coast Range. I think when you look at the water picture in general, this is a chart from DWR's Bulletin 160. The region is in balance with respect to its water resources, and I think that's important. The water managers think a lot about that in a lot of different ways, and I think it's important that we start the conversation of sustainability with this idea that the region is in balance, and obviously we're going to continue to work to make sure that that stays the case. Stressors, obviously something that this board has talked a lot about and really drives, of course, a lot of the discussion, you know, whether it's the PPIC reports, whether it's the National Academy reports, pick your reports. We find that most of the reports have agreed that more or less these 5 areas are the stressors that we are working towards. And obviously, as part of our sustainability effort, we are working very closely on trying to figure out how are we going to address all of those stressors, some of which we're going to talk about today because they tend to be in your purview. People want to talk about flows, obviously an important component of the sustainability. And here's just a simple diagram of kind of what we see as the kind of the opportunities here in the Sacramento Valley. Obviously, the baseline flows on the bottom include your inflow and outflow requirements, largely designed for the pelagic fish. Then you have the various tributary flows, which I'll show a diagram here in a second of all the agreements that are in the Sacramento Valley that have all happened since 2006, updating your water quality control plan. We are talking about, and Lewis will talk about some of this in a moment, some additional pulse flow opportunities on the Sacramento River that we think will add some real value. And then there's a variety of other tributary flows. We have talked about jump-starting some of what I think you're contemplating in phase 4 of the process that Les described, and we think there's some opportunities in the tributaries to be doing some more. And then, of course, there's a variety of water transfers that have taken place in the region. That's for refuges, that's for in-basin uses, that's for other in-stream purposes, as well as obviously for other parts of the state. Here's the chart that I think captures the agreements that have been put together in the Sacramento Valley, and it's kind of small, so I apologize for that, but it's a big region, and trying to capture this on one slide is not easy, and this doesn't even capture all of the agreements, to be honest. It captures a lot of the major ones, but I think, as folks know, I think this is important. Since 2006 update, there's been various agreements from the American River to the Yuba River to the Bear River. Obviously, you've approved the relicensing on the Feather River. There's been biological opinions, of course, in the related RPAs on the Sacramento River and the system, and there's just been a whole series of agreements, and these have all been designed for the fishery beneficial purpose in large part, and have the support and have involved the fishery agencies, which I think is significant, obviously. And these are all fairly new. There's a lot of work that's going on in each one of these. I think a good example, of course, Kurt's here, is many of you were at the symposium last week on the Yuba River. Whole process there, very sophisticated, very state-of-the-art science, and I think that's just one kind of snapshot of the things that are going on in the region to make sure that we get the flows right. I think in some, the flow regimes in the valley really provide a foundation for sustainability, of course, and each one of these has been carefully crafted. Some of them took 35 years, quite honestly, which a lot of you know the history there. These don't come easy. And I think the other thing is the sustainability plan that we're talking about will work towards the 5 stressors that we talked about earlier, and of course, with respect to the water quality control plan, make sure that we are in fact protecting and enhancing the beneficial uses of water within the region. Oops, 1 too fast. I'm sorry. I'm not very good with this clicker. I'm going to turn it over to Lewis, who's now going to give a story on the Sacramento River on some of the things that we're contemplating.
Chairman Marcus, members of the board, thanks for your time. As a manager, I think what I'd like to take us down to is really kind of practical things on the ground that we're trying to get done, and things that we fit within really your existing plan of implementation, and things that could be carried out moving forward. RD 108 is a settlement contractor. One of the larger settlement contractors. We divert about 160,000 acre-feet from the Sacramento River. And I'll speak mostly from that perspective today. There's certainly the American and Feather and other rivers, but my expertise is from there. So this particular slide is really an illustration that just shows that there's a lot of functions of water as it flows through the Sacramento Valley. It's a flow-through system. The water returns all back to the Sacramento River, but it's one that is highly managed for all of these purposes. And so our district certainly has wildlife habitat. Some of the districts in the valley are serving refuges. It's a very integrated water system, and so it becomes a complex management task. Anytime we want to make a change, we want to make something a little bit better, more efficient, we find that we push here and it pops out over here. So it takes a lot of coordination, a lot of energy, and a lot of leadership to try to improve what we're doing right now. But I think it's something that there's energy in the valley right now to do, and I'd like to talk to you about some of those things that we're trying to do now. So this is kind of a table of some of the objectives or actions along the river system that we think need to be managed, that could be improved, that that we can learn from. You know, maybe we make mistakes, maybe we do things that are better, but we learn from those, we adjust, we adaptively manage. This is organized kind of from the upstream end on down, and I wanted to talk about a couple of the projects along the way. So you can see things like, you know, maximizing cold water storage, improving spawning habitat below reservoirs. If you keep rolling down, maintaining constant flows downstream of reservoirs to ensure proper spawning habitat and avoid stranding. So this is something that has really evolved over the last kind of 25 years. As a settlement contract, our contracts expire October 31st. So we have a fairly reliable water supply through October 31st. We no longer can burn rice straw stubble. So at the end of rice harvest, which is usually the first or second week of October, the guys farm, they mechanically break up the rice straw and then incorporate it into the soils, and then they flood it with water. And it's important to have warmer temperatures for the microbes to actually decompose the straw. So it's important for them to flood the fields as early as possible. It's also important because although many of us have winter water rights, those are subject to Term 91 and are less reliable starting November 1st. So the typical operation criteria for a district like ours is when you finish harvest, you want to get flooded up as quickly as you can to ensure it's done by October 31st. This creates an operational river, at least along the Sacramento River, where the Bureau is ramping up flows to meet these demands in mid to late October. Well, what happens then is we have a higher river up near Shasta, and what ends up happening then is the salmon that are spawning at that time spawn in the upper edges of the stream. So what we've proposed here, actually what was proposed by Golden Gate Salmon Association, and as settlement contractors we've been supporting, what we've proposed is a way to smooth those flows. So we don't have the peak flows in October and then a lower demand in November and December. And the strategy for this is really kind of a water transfer, or a way to move water from October to November and December, so we can kind of reverse the operations of the Sacramento River. Instead of the operations dictating, or I'm sorry, instead of the district's operations dictating what's released from Shasta, the districts would modify their behavior. They would spread out their decomposition. We'd work with our growers to defer some of the decomp. And what the Bureau of Reclamation under David Mooney's leadership would provide is a way for us to take some of that October water and move it into November and December. So what the river would see in the upstream reaches is they wouldn't have this peaking of flow in the upper end of the Sacramento River where the fish are spawning. They'd be able to bring the river down to lower flows. And then we would continue those into November and December. It would slightly impact some of the decomp operations, but it has a substantial savings. As an example, you know, often the peak flows can be in the 6,000 or 7,000 CFS range in the spawning areas. If we can reduce those peak flows by 1,000 CFS, that's 2,000 acre feet per day. What ends up happening is you end up having to carry those flows for a month, 2 months, even 3 months at times, depending on the year type. At 60,000 acre feet per month, that can result in, you know, 120, 180,000 acre feet of water. It's very substantial. The other thing that's obviously a problem is if you don't have the water and you do have to lower the river elevations, you can lose some of those reds that spawn some of the listed species that are spawning on the edges of the river channels. So we've actually started working on this project. We had a meeting with the Bureau's operations staff and talk to them about some of the challenges, you know, when you push in here, what pops out. We also had a follow-up meeting. The Bureau was able to bring in the agencies, National Marine Fishery Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, California Fish and Wildlife Service, and had our first meeting, discuss the project description, discuss some of the challenges with permitting and how we might initiate this project, at least on a trial period, see how it works, see if things work, and then be able to adjust from that point. So we're going to be meeting regularly. That project description, Friday, we're going to all have our comments in onto that. And if we don't see any adverse impacts to species, we anticipate being able to adjust our operations this year and hopefully make a difference and a change on the ground. So we think those types of activities are very important and need to be initiated, and I'm glad to see the Bureau and other folks stepping forward to do that. So as you go down here, something that everybody's been talking about is pulse flows. You know, how do you design an escapement plan for salmon in the spring, especially in difficult years like this where you have low storage? Well, you know, whose water is that comes up with pulse flows? Well, I think there are opportunities like your board orders that talk about the temperature control strategy. I think those were very flexible orders. They're orders that are being implemented in a way that is probably a little less flexible. It's not as inclusive. It tends to be, in fact, water users like ourselves are not invited to those. And I think we could offer opportunities to change our operations potentially to help with that. I think having some sort of coordinating group like many of the other rivers that was more inclusive could be helpful for something like that. And in the studies that we've had Dave Vogel do.
Can you stop right there?
Yeah,
Who would be
sorry.
on such a coordinating group?
Well, I
How
think
would you
there's
envision
different groups right now, and different folks are meeting for operations. Different folks are managing the hatchery work. Different folks are managing the temperature control strategy. And in my mind, most, if not all of the folks are in the room, except for the water users, actually, the end users right now. But bringing those together, building trust, building relationships, I think collectively as a group could actually produce a lot of benefits. And I think we see that with this fall operations scenario. This is something that came up. We all got together, and you know, it looks like something we can do something about. So the pulse flow that Dave Vogel has taken a look at that and looked at an out-migration strategy or an escapement strategy, whatever you want to call it. The volume of water potentially that could be saved in this fall operations is probably twice the amount that Mr. Vogel is thinking that we would need for a pulse flow. And so our thought is if you can do certain things creatively, maybe it allows you the resources to work on things like the escapement plan, which in our mind, you know, brings in the hatchery folks for coordinated releases of hatchery fish. It looks at forecasted weather operations to try to minimize what you'd need to release from storage for a pulse flow. It looks at the water users and says, hey, can you back off of your diversions while we're doing this operation and trying to encourage fish to out-migrate. It also looks at delta operations and says, how do you make sure that the fish get through the delta, or whatever you can do to help with fish getting through the delta. So coordinating that type of activity would be ideal for this type of group that we're talking about. So I think those are kind of the thoughts and on-the-ground stuff that I wanted to share with you today, and I think we're looking forward to working with some of the other partners that I think you'll hear from later to try to get some of these things on the ground and moving.
You know, this reminds me of the demand response on songs and in energy. You know, having a demand response capability when there's something to be worked around or helped along or whatever. So no, that's quite creative.
Well, we'd benefit from your thinking and knowledge of that if we could.
Well, I think generally the public would assume we already do this.
Yes.
And so
Yeah, and it's kind of amazing that we don't.
it is amazing that we don't in terms of the scarce resources. So appreciate your time on it.
My wife
Well,
tells me that as well.
Just to kind of close out here, at your last workshop, we had, of course, proposed some ideas that we had on kind of your process going forward. I think your idea of the focus synthesis that Les described earlier, we're very supportive of that. I think that makes a lot of sense combined with the predation workshop that is being conducted alongside of that, and we're very much interested in working with you in that. And then, of course, we continue to propose that you try to adopt a water quality control plan update by June of next year. I know that sounds ambitious, but in our view, that's originally what of course, the Stewardship Council had proposed, and we think that is something that we are committed to working toward. If it's okay with you, we've been having some very positive conversations with both the Nature Conservancy and American Rivers, and Jay Ziegler and Steve Rothert are here today, and if